I feel a bit weird admitting this, but my mom was apparently pretty wild back in college. She did settle down after that, including when she met my dad, and me and my two siblings were fortunate enough to grow up in a loving household. However, as a reminder of our mom's college days, we'd randomly encounter people she used to know. It became kind of a running joke in our family. There are a lot of strange and funny stories we could tell about them, but there was one encounter that led to something truly terrifying. I'm the oldest child, and when this happened I was 5 and my younger brother and sister were 4 and 3. They and our dad were all somewhere else when this went down, maybe a birthday party for a kid at their preschool, so this only happened to me. It was a Saturday morning and my mom and I got donuts and went to one of the larger parks several miles from where we lived. This was kind of our tradition, one which we continued with my siblings for years to come. We got to the park around 10:30, and by that time it was already pretty busy. There were 2 huge playgrounds, one for the younger kids and one for the older ones, as well as rock climbing walls and various other pieces of equipment like little merry-go-rounds. I immediately ran over to one of the playgrounds, and 5 minutes later I heard my mom calling me. Reluctantly I came back, thinking we needed to leave, but I was relieved to see her talking to another woman I'd never seen before. When I walked up, my mom introduced me to her as Miss Angela. I don't want to comment too much on this lady's appearance, but I will say it was off-putting. For starters, she seemed to be a heavy smoker, and she greeted me very loud and enthusiastically. I wasn't even that shy of a kid, but after 30 seconds of her asking get-to-know-you type questions, I just wanted to leave and go back to the playground. That's when Miss Angela let out this weird laugh and told me to go play with her son Owen. She pointed to the playground as my mom and her laughed. There was a kid who looked to be my same age sitting on one of the sidewalks drawing with chalk, so I assumed that was him. My mom motioned for me to go over and say hi, and I was fine with that, anything to get away from that lady. I walked over to Owen, who immediately looked up and said, "Hey there." I said, "Hey, I think your mom's friends with my mom." Owen didn't seem to acknowledge that, but he handed me a piece of chalk from the bucket on the ground and asked if I wanted to draw something. I figured I might as well, so I took the chalk and moved a few rectangles over on the concrete. I can't remember what I was drawing, but at some point I noticed that Owen was writing big letters, and realized that they were swear words. I won't repeat them here, but to give you an idea, there were a few F-bombs and things even worse. Then Owen saw that I noticed what he was writing, and he handed me another piece of chalk and told me to write more of those words. Now, maybe under some circumstances I would have been down to misbehave a bit, but there were tons of people at the park, and our moms were almost close enough to see what we were writing. I figured they'd walk over at some point as well. I hesitated, and then Owen very nonchalantly called me a name and went back to drawing. I didn't know what to do, but I really didn't want to keep drawing with this kid's chalk, so I just set my piece back in his bucket and went over to some of the play equipment. Things were fine for another 5 minutes or so, but then out of the blue this older guy came up to me while I was running across one of the bridges on the playground. The man looked to be in his 40s, average height, stocky build, and wearing a t-shirt and jeans. He walked right up to the side of the bridge and said, "Excuse me," several times in a loud voice. Nervously I said hello and looked over at my mom still talking to Miss Angela. The man bluntly asked, "Did you draw those nasty words?" and my heart sank. I immediately told the man no, that it was someone else, and the man told me to come down off the play equipment so I could help him find who wrote it. The man wasn't wearing any kind of uniform, but based on how assertive he was being, I think I figured he worked for the park. I walked over to a set of climbing bars that led up to one of the platforms and climbed down. When I reached the bottom, I looked towards the sidewalk where Owen had been sitting and saw he wasn't there anymore. Then I looked up at the man and said the kid wasn't there. Thankfully, the man seemed to believe me and appeared grateful for what I told him, as his voice softened and he became more friendly. He introduced himself as Bob and told me he was responsible for keeping the park looking nice. He said he needed to get some supplies from one of the sheds to clean off the sidewalk, as they couldn't leave the writing there for other people to see. Then Bob asked if I wanted to help him. Honestly, this should have been a huge red flag, but maybe because it was a strange situation, I actually agreed. I started walking with Bob, or whatever his real name was, in the opposite direction from my mom and Miss Angela. Soon we had exited the playground area with the wood chips and were cutting across one of the soccer fields. I began to wonder where Bob's truck was, as it didn't seem like we were walking to any of the parking lots. In fact, it looked like we were headed to the forest surrounding the park. Only when we were almost to the other side of the soccer field did I summon the courage to ask Bob where his truck was. He He looked down at me and hesitated for a moment, then told me it was right through there and pointed into the forest. I couldn't see anything where he was pointing besides trees, and I think he realized I was catching on. Bob's expression changed, but right at that moment I heard someone yell in the distance. I squinted and saw my mom running across the field after us. Bob and I kept looking each other dead in the eye, and I felt sure he was deciding whether or not to pick me up and run into the forest. Thank God he decided against that, and instead took off running a second later. I began running in the opposite direction towards my mom, and then she scooped me up in her arms. My mom started yelling at me that I shouldn't have gone off with that strange man, though I think she was just emotional for me almost getting kidnapped. I spilled the beans about how Owen was writing bad words with a chalk and the man was pretending to be a park worker. Then my mom started to direct her anger towards Owen and his mom, but by the time we made it back to the playground, they had already left. I think my mom reported what happened to the police, but I don't remember anything else happening after that. I don't think about what happened too often, though it does pop into my mind from time to time. It's disturbing to think about how that man was so easily able to exploit the situation and gain my trust, and get me to go along with him. It's also weird to think that this was due in part to some kid drawing bad words with chalk. It was the summer after my junior year, and I was working part-time at our local shopping center. A lot of it went how you might expect, and nothing too out of the ordinary would happen. Then this one day I was doing stock work with some of the seasonal items, including those cheap plastic squirt guns and buckets of chalk. Partway through restocking, I ran out of buckets of chalk, and so I went to try to find another pallet of them in the back. Oddly enough, there didn't seem to be any more, even though I remembered seeing another pallet of chalk sometime earlier in the week. I checked in with David, our shift manager, and he and I went back to the stockroom. After 5 minutes of searching, we still couldn't find them. David just told me to move on to the next batch of items, and that he'd try to locate the chalk later. Cut forward a few hours, and it was right before the end of my shift. David told me he found the missing pallet, which apparently had other stuff placed in front of it that would need to be moved. Therefore, it was up to me to move it. A few minutes later, I went back to the stockroom with a pallet jack, and found the place David described. He wasn't kidding, the chalk was way in the back, and I sighed as I saw I'd have to move like 5 other things to get to it. Eventually I did, and when I finally loaded up the pallet of chalk, I saw that the shrink wrap had apparently been removed. Not only that, but it looked like it was pulled back down over the sides to make it seem like it hadn't been opened. I didn't immediately think much of it, and just took the pallet back to the seasonal aisle and started cutting through the shrink wrap and removing the cardboard supports. That's when I noticed that the individual buckets of chalk looked like they'd been opened too. Now I was intrigued. I took off the lid to one of the buckets and looked inside, but would never have guessed what it was. It looked like drugs, specifically cocaine. I had zero idea what to do in this situation, so I just put the lid back on and took the pallet back to the stockroom. Then I found and told David, who immediately thought I was joking. We went back to the stockroom and I showed him, and then he believed me, but he also had no idea what to do. He ended up calling the store manager, who arrived 20 minutes later, and only after confirming our story did that person call the cops. By this time, a lot of the other employees had heard about what happened and tried to come by the stockroom to see if it was real. When the cops arrived, they talked to me, David, and the store manager, and also set up a crime scene around that area in the back room. It was pretty unreal, but it wasn't necessarily scary per se. Eventually they told us we could leave, and I just drove back home. 2 days later, I was working the late shift, meaning I would be doing more stock work and help with closing. Our store stayed open until 11 p.m., but it was pretty quiet those last couple of hours. The night went as usual, and around 10, me and this one other dude, Jeremy, started restocking products in the beauty and pharmacy section. It was one of the areas furthest away from the stockrooms, so it was kind of annoying to walk back and forth. Eventually we had almost finished with the first batch of stuff we brought, and Jeremy volunteered to walk back and get more. So I sat there and continued to pick up various bottles of vitamins. A few minutes later I finished, but Jeremy wasn't back yet, so I started doing stuff on my phone. I figured Jeremy made a detour to the bathroom, but when he still wasn't back 5 minutes later, I began to get curious. I visited the bathroom myself, and Jeremy wasn't in there, so I continued to walk to the stockroom. I pushed open the double doors and called out for Jeremy, but didn't hear anything. It was dead quiet, though there were only like 2 other employees in the entire store. I said Jeremy's name again and walked over to the location of the next batch of items we needed, but he wasn't there. I eventually walked all over the stockroom, checking the cracks between each of the pallets, but I still didn't see anyone. Now Jeremy wasn't the type of person to just dip, so this was a little concerning. I tried out our radio, but Jeremy didn't respond, and neither of the other two employees knew where he was. We made an announcement over the PA system and searched all the remaining employees-only sections like the break room and surveillance room. Jeremy was nowhere to be seen. I did confirm that his car was still parked out front. At least, I was pretty sure it was his. By now it was almost 11. Me and the other male employee, Luke, decided to walk once around the outside of the building. If there was still no sign of Jeremy, we'd call and let the manager know. Meanwhile, the other employee, Kara, would stay inside and keep closing up. So Luke and I went out the front doors and started walking clockwise around the building. When we were almost to the back, Luke stopped and asked me if I heard that. I stopped walking, and a second later I heard what sounded like someone throwing boxes around, and every now and then a metal clang. I didn't know exactly what I was expecting to see when we turned the corner, but I was not at all prepared for what we saw. There was Jeremy, only he was laying on the ground, and his arms and legs were tied and his mouth was taped shut. A second later, Luke and I saw where the banging was coming from. The lid to one of the dumpsters was open, and someone was going through it. Jeremy noticed us and tried to scream, and Luke and I both froze. Then Luke gestured for Jeremy to be quiet and started walking over to him. I came too, and we helped Jeremy up while trying to be as quiet as possible. When we got back around the side of the store, Luke ripped the tape off his mouth and we all started running. When we got back inside, Kara saw what happened to Jeremy and she started screaming. Luke calmly told Kara to come with us to the back, where we locked ourselves inside the break room and started cutting the rope off of Jeremy. He was pretty shaken, but managed to describe how when he went to the stockroom, there was some older mobster-looking guy looking through things. When Jeremy asked what he was doing, the guy pulled out a gun and forced him outside. I hadn't made the connection to what happened with the chalk buckets before, and it hit me all at once. When the guy asked Jeremy what happened to the drugs, Jeremy honestly told him he didn't know, and that's when the man tied Jeremy up and started going through the dumpsters. A minute after Jeremy finished telling us this, we heard police sirens get closer, and it was 1,000 pounds off our shoulders. Apparently the guy was still in one of the dumpsters when they found him, and he surrendered immediately. Looking back, this whole experience just seems so bizarre. Whatever criminal organization was trafficking that stuff inside of chalk containers had to be one of the dumbest ones ever. Needless to say, there was a huge investigation after these events took place, but I'm not sure if whoever was running things got caught. I only worked at that job for another 3 weeks before my senior year started, and outside of everyone asking me what happened, nothing else even remotely eventful happened. One thing I don't like to think about is, what would have happened if Luke hadn't been with me, and I'd come across Jeremy all tied up on my own? Would I have been brave enough to try to rescue him? It's not a pleasant thought, and ultimately, I'm just glad we were all okay. My dad left me and my mom when I was 4, and it's still one of the most difficult things to talk about. I remember my mom crying to herself at night and worrying about things constantly throughout the day. I won't go into more personal details, aside from saying there were good aspects to his leaving, including my mom and I not being afraid in the evenings waiting for him to come home. My mom would usually pick me up from daycare around 6 after she got off of work, and we'd drive back home and eat dinner. Sometimes we'd go for walks around the neighborhood or visit one of the nearby parks, but a lot of the time I was on my own. One thing I liked to do was to draw. Using sidewalk chalk on our driveway was 1,000 times better than staying inside that house. There weren't a lot of other families with young kids that lived near us, so I'd usually just draw by myself for several hours on the driveway until it was time to go to sleep. One evening, about 2 months after my dad left, I was sitting down on the driveway drawing when I felt the distinct sensation that someone was watching me. I looked over my shoulder, and there was another boy about my same age. He didn't appear to be with anyone, and he was just standing there. I said hey, and he said hey back. He walked over to me and I asked him his name. He told me his name was Tony, and I told him mine was Ben. Tony asked if he could help me draw something, and I handed him a piece of chalk. We drew non-stop for 2 hours, making up stories about what we were drawing. Maybe because we were so engrossed in what we were doing, I didn't ask Tony a lot of personal questions, like where he lived. Eventually the porch lights turned off, which was my mom's signal that it was time to come in and go to bed. I said goodnight to Tony, and he set down the piece of chalk he was holding next to me and started walking away. Then I walked into our garage and closed the garage door before walking into the house. The next time I saw Tony was 2 weeks later. Like before, I didn't notice him walk up, but instead just turned around and he was there. We drove for another 2 hours, but halfway through I had to go inside to use the bathroom. It seemed strange to just leave someone I was playing with on our driveway, so I asked if Tony wanted to come inside. He said yes, and as we walked through the door to our garage, I announced his presence to my mom. She was sitting in the bed in her bedroom, but walked out and greeted Tony. After asking him his name, she asked if he lived nearby, to which he answered yes. After using the bathroom, we both went back outside while my mom stayed inside. We continued to draw with the chalk and make up stories until my mom turned the porch lights out, at which time I said goodbye to Tony and went back inside. That summer I spent a lot of the evenings outside, and Tony would frequently be there. We started to build a friendship and would pick up our drawings and stories right where we left off the last time. Honestly, it was hard to cope with our situation sometimes, especially on the days my mom couldn't or didn't feel like doing anything, and it was nice to have someone to mention things to. Tony never brought up anything about his family, and maybe because I assumed he had problems at home too, I never asked him about it. Towards the end of summer, my mom would come out sometimes to check on us, and would offer Tony a drink of water or soda if we had some. When she came, we'd excitedly explain what we had been drawing, and she'd always at least try to appear interested. The next year, my mom got a job closer to where my grandparents lived so that we could move back to their area for extra support. I'm pretty sure they offered to just let us move in with them, but my mom didn't want to do that. I vividly remember the last couple of nights we spent in the house, and while I won't go into detail, it was very emotional for both me and my mom. The last time Tony had been here was a few weeks ago, and while I told him that we'd be moving, we never mentioned an exact date. The night before we left, I stayed outside, hoping for him to show up, but he didn't. We left the next morning, and I never saw Tony again. After we moved into our new house, I didn't really bring up Tony, and I thought my mom didn't bring him up either because she felt bad we had to move away. But years later, when I was in the 5th grade, I made an extremely unsettling discovery. I can still remember the exact day it happened too. I had just gotten off the school bus and was walking up the sidewalk, and my mom was outside sweeping the driveway. We said hi to each other, and for some reason I decided to make a joke about how she was cleaning it off so Tony and I could draw with chalk. My mom didn't seem to acknowledge what I had said, so I just walked inside and put my backpack down. Later at dinner I thought about Tony again, and asked my mom how she thought he had been doing. My mom seemed confused, and asked if Tony was someone from my class. I got a little upset, and told her I was talking about Tony, the kid from our old neighborhood. She kept looking at me with this blank expression, so I reminded her it was him that I always drew chalk pictures with. Then my mom said something that absolutely shook me. "One of your friends drew pictures with you?" The words hung in the air as I tried to come to terms with the fact my mom wasn't kidding. I brought up more details, such as my mom offering us water and soda, and the first time Tony came into our house. But my mom still had no idea. Now, my mom was and still is as sharp as a tack, and she would never play a practical joke like pretending someone didn't exist. Finally, after like 5 or 10 minutes of trying to jog her memory, I let the topic drop, and after dinner I went up to my room. I sat in the chair at my desk for a long time, replaying all these memories. They all seemed completely real. 10 more years have passed, and to this day I'm not 100% sure of what happened. My main 2 theories are that either my mom was so depressed that she somehow blocked Tony out of her mind, or I was so upset with the situation that I came up with him as an imaginary friend. That would mean I also had to have imagined the interactions that my mom had with Tony. However painful it is to think about, I have to admit the second option seems more likely. And in addition to knowing those memories weren't real, it's sad to think I'll never be able to see him again, which is something I thought about a lot right after we moved. It may sound strange, but I want to have my own family, just so my kids can have happy experiences like that.